So now it's time to dive into my future watercolor. So again, just like the others, I'm gonna go ahead and just start to layer in and do kind of flat washes in kind of these big blocks. So this is an easy one to start off because I have this big blue sky. So I'm gonna just go ahead and start with a flat wash here because it's actually a very flat tone in the sky. I can also pull this down. So I'll put really heavy amount of watercolor along the top, get a really, really wet brush. I'm gonna switch to an even bigger brush and start to pull that color down. We get this beautiful transition, just like in the sky. And just be mindful as I inch closer to this cool little trailer. It's like a retro camper, super fun. So I'm gonna load it up again, bring it down. Really fun. So I'll probably let that dry and then go over it again a second time. So blocking that in, that looks pretty good. Then I will start to block in. I'm working top to bottom too, in case you didn't notice. I'm gonna create a nice kind of cool gray. So I'm gonna grab lots of white, have a touch of blue, and the tiniest bit of black I'll grab. And keeping in mind with watercolor, we can always go darker. So that's really what we want to be mindful of as we build up our layers, that there's no rush to go dark. We can always layer and get darker as we work. So I'm always pretty cautious not to go too dark. I'm going to be really careful because this blue is wet and I don't want it to bleed. So I might stay away a little bit. It's a good idea to probably switch to a smaller brush, make sure it's nice and clean. Load it up and start to fill in this whole top half. And then I'll switch over, got to keep that zigzag white. So I'm gonna be very careful not to paint that zigzag detail. I'm also avoiding these top caps on these windows because they have really strong highlights. So I want to leave most white, and then I'll go back in and add just a touch of a shadow so I can bring out the highlight, but I'm not even going to paint it right now. So keep going here. It's all good. Great. So I'm going to let that base layer dry, and now I'm going to move on to make this kind of peachy red. Let's see what we got. A little bit of red. I might give it a little bit of orange, make it more salmon. And then it's pretty kind of pastel, so I'm gonna add some white. Cool. Start to block. Oh, that's a good color match. Start to block that in as well. So this one's a pretty flat wash. You know, pulling in the sky, getting that nice gradation is great, but for the majority of this lower half, I'm going to be pretty particular. Try to stay within my edges. I don't want too much bleeding. So I'm not going to let my paint get too thin because that's when it might kind of run a bit more than I want it to. So I'm gonna keep working that in. Remember that if your colors that you mix on your lid dry, you can just reactivate them with water, so I don't have to worry about that color. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna keep it there on my palette, and then I will add more darks to do kind of the shadows there. So before I drop this shadow in under, I'm gonna build in, again, probably starting with that gray, and then layer on some warm tones to make this gravel in the foreground. And up here is a shadow, so I can just go ahead and block out this whole area. We need to be careful with black. We always try to like save it for the end or near the end and use it really sparingly. Sometimes we don't want to use it at all in watercolor because it can really get out of hand, so we want to be really careful. I'm going to save those shadows for later for sure, for closer to the end. So I have that base, and then I'm going to go ahead and layer on some warm tones to pull out the warm tones in the gravel. And I'm going to keep this kind of base coat, and once these base coats dry, I'm going to go ahead and start layering back in. So what my plan is for this gravel is to create a nice speckly texture. So I might try out a few different techniques. I might do some flicking of my paintbrush to get some little speckles maybe. We'll see how it goes. Remember that you want to keep that kind of thing controlled. So when I do that, I'm going to be really mindful to make sure I'm covering areas that I don't want there to be speckles of paint on. So that's going to be really, really important. So grabbing just a super dark gray, I'm going to start to fill in some of the details here on my wheel. So it's metallic, and we need to kind of create the effect of metal by using our gray tones. So what I'll do once this is dry is I'll start to come in with the darker gray. See how the light and shadow kind of catches along the top. I'll start to come in with these darker tones so that I can create some contrast and this kind of effect we have of this. Oh, it almost looks like siding on a house. Just kind of gently layer that in. And then again, I'm gonna be really delicate. I can always go back in and get darker. That's not a problem, but I don't want to lay down with like a really heavy hand and then freak out because it's too dark. So I'm going to be really careful not to be too crazy, too intense. I'm going to build up my tones really softly so that I feel like I'm in control. I love doing these little watercolors. It reminds me of a like children's book, like an illustration, which feels really sweet and fun, or like I could picture them as postcards even. So I'll start to build in my shadow here with, it's not black, it's gray, it's pretty dark, but knowing that it's gonna get darker later, this is just going to be helpful for me to see some contrast while I'm working and get around my tire, all that good stuff. So I'm going to keep on going, building my first layer, kind of working in a few more details, letting this first pass really, really dry, and then we'll go back in, have some fun creating some texture in the foreground, highlighting some more shadows here on the trailer as well, and before you know it, it'll be finished. All right, so now it's time to put the finishing touches on my cool little retro camper here. So I'm gonna go ahead and, just like my others, build up a little bit of shadowing. So I'm going to just kind of intensify what's here and also kind of pull out what is these kind of siding lines here, kind of bring them forward. Again, not using black, using, you know, our darker hue, our darker value to bring those to life. You know, these are small paintings, so we want to be careful not to like overdo it. We can definitely have a tendency to want to put in as much detail as possible. But sometimes, you know, small gestures go a long way. So we're going to try to focus on that and just kind of creating the illusion by using things like our changes in value and providing more detail that way. So I might take just a touch of water to kind of blend and soften those lines a tiny bit. Remember to keep your really white areas white if possible. I'll do the same and go in and create some more kind of shadowing in the camper. So with a really kind of soft touch. Just kind of pumping up the contrast. But again, using a gray, I'm not using straight black. It would be too harsh. Creating some shadowing here. So I'll continue to work through these final highlights and shadows, catching some texture. We talked about creating some texture in the gravel. So using a nice kind of like dry brushing, kind of try to catch some of that. We can also do a little splattering if I wanted to. So if I wanted to splatter, I could go ahead and cover the areas I don't want splatters, so that's very important. I could dip my brush in some of this brown, and then I could selectively splatter to create some cool texture, which I love. Splatters aren't for everywhere, but it looks pretty good there. It creates a really cool rocky texture. So if you have an area that would work for splatters, go for it. It's a pretty fun one. Make sure you're being in control. You're being careful not to splatter the whole painting, just areas where you need it. So I'm going to go ahead and put in all these final shadows, and then just like my others, I will wait until it dries, and then I will carefully erase any stray pencils, and I will pull up the tape, making sure it's dry. Don't pull up the tape before it's dry, and then it'll be ready to go.